I'm really pleased to welcome Bev Gibbs to talk to provoke us this afternoon. Bev's come from the University of Nottingham. She's in that delicate stage of just finishing a PhD, but it'll be very close to finishing. And she's just about to move on to UCL. Bev works at that really interesting interface between engineering and public policy and scientific citizenship. So I think she'll be really interesting and very provoking for us this afternoon. So I'll just hand over.
Okay.
And off you go.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be here today. It's been a while since I've been at Open University, so it's always good to be back. Beautiful campus, nearly as nice as ours at Nottingham. I will tell you a little bit about myself just as background, because it does kind of impact the way that I view some of these questions, I think. And then I'll tell you a little bit about where I'm going to be working soon, because Rick's kind of given me permission to do a little bit of a plug. And then we'll start to talk about some questions around scientific citizenship, what that might mean, what it might not mean, public engagement, and what's happening in Scotland as far as energy and a low carbon transition goes. So I left school when I was 16. I come from a very normal background, and I was an engineering apprentice for some time. I worked in manufacturing SMEs, and I did all of my education part-time, so after about 8 years, I got a degree. And that's an unusual story, except when you come to the OU, I think, and I think that you kind of are surrounded with those kind of stories all the time, because we know what the long haul is, don't we? So I practiced as an engineer for a while. I was a research scientist at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, where I worked on a manufacturing metrology project in Nice, which was very nice. And then I moved into research management and strategic management of research in a science organisation. I did an MBA where I looked at the role of performance measurement systems in facilitating strategic change in knowledge-intensive environments. Then I moved into the commercial management of engineering. And so I have moved around the kind of the technical side of things and the commercial side of things. And then when I was working in commerce, I kind of realised that there was a social impact to this technology and engineering that we were doing. I was working in mining, and so you can imagine some of the challenges that we were facing there in the management of that. And I thought, actually, there's an interface here that I haven't looked at. I've looked a lot at what happens between engineering and science and industry, but what happens between engineering and science and society. And so at that point, I thought, actually, it's probably about time that I did that PhD that I've been wanting to do for ages. And so I went to Nottingham and was lucky enough to get a studentship looking at the role of intermediaries and scientific citizenship in Scotland. So that's where I've done my PhD. I work closely with the Making Science Public programme, which Nick Mahoney is an honorary associate. An honorary associate. We're really lucky he comes and shares his expertise on publics, which is an important part of the programme. From February, I'll be working full-time at University College London in their new department for Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy. And the bit that I wanted to plug was the bit about our new master's programme, which starts in September. So as a new department, obviously we have a flagship educational programme, and this is what this is. And so it is really geared towards practitioners, and I don't know how many practitioners there are in the audience, but I was hoping that there might be some, which is why I'm kind of flagging this up here really. So it's people who want to work practically at the interface between the production and mobilisation of knowledge and how that gets used in policy. And if they're the kind of questions that interest you, then please come and look at our master's programme. It'll have a balanced cohort of technical people and social science-oriented people, policy people, working in interdisciplinary teams together, looking at the what of science, technology, engineering and public policy. So what kind of knowledge systems come into play? What's the difference between the different knowledge systems? What's in common with them? We'll look at adaptive policy making. So not just policy an idea that policy is static and it can be rolled out, but something that's much more attuned to the kind of flexible, ongoing, dynamic challenges that we get in science and engineering. We'll look at critical reflections on decision-making systems through evidence, institutions and power, and the knowledge landscapes that are operating and inform policy. So if these are some of the things that you're interested in, come and have a look at the master's programme, and we'll be really happy to chat to you about it. So that's at UCL, at the Department of Science and Engineering and public policy. Right, that's that. And I go back to the slide now. Right, okay, so back to Nottingham, where I've been very happy for a few years. So my PhD was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and the Scottish Government, and so I could have done it on anything at all, but it had to be in Scotland. And the biggest kind of challenge that they were facing was this issue of energy, and because I kind of have a bit of a bias towards engineering, that suited me quite well. So today what I wanted to do was to talk about what ideas of citizenship might mean on a science society landscape, and that'll be primarily drawn from literature because that's the framework that I developed and took through into my empirical work. So the journey that we'll go on is pretty much like the PhD journey that I went on. So we'll talk about publics as receivers, and we'll talk about dialogue, and we'll talk about co-creation between lay and expert, if you like those words. We're going to talk about the role of consumers and consumption and business, and we'll talk about counterpublics, so very oriented in civil society. We'll perhaps have a think about what citizenship can offer science and society and what science and society can say to citizenship. Then I'll turn to the empirical work that I did around a low-carbon Scotland, and then I'm really hoping that the second half of what we do today, if I maybe talk for about half an hour, we can actually have a discussion, and I'd really, really like that discussion. I don't just want you to ask me questions about who I interviewed or what I did and what I found. If we could actually have a debate about some of these questions that I'm going to put, that would actually be really, really helpful. Well, it would be for me, and I would hope it would be for you. But we'll see. So why do we talk about scientific citizenship? I mean, we talk about citizenship all the time. You can put anything in front of it you like. It's a snow clone, I think you call it, don't you? Ecological citizenship, biological citizenship. Why scientific citizenship? So I signed up for a PhD that looked at the role of intermediaries on scientific citizenship. And so I started looking very closely at intermediaries. And I read Rick's amazing 2 books, which I loved. They were the first books that I read, and they were so helpful, with your chapter in as well, Anne. And I thought there's something about this question about scientific citizenship that I just don't get. I can't find it in the literature. And I kind of put it to one side for about 8 months, and then I thought, you know, actually it's just not there. It's a thing that we talk about, and it's a thing that we mention, but there isn't really a solid piece of literature that says this is what we might mean by it, these are what its attributes are. And so I had to start, not from scratch, there is some work obviously, but to start to develop what the rationale for that might be. So I think there's kind of 3 strands here that I would bring out as we start to think about why we would talk about scientific citizenship. The first one is closely associated with ideas of scientific literacy, and I'll go right back now to the House of Lords report that kind of puts forward this idea that kind of really set the agenda for public understanding of science, and said, you know, actually what we need is a population that's that can talk articulately around science and the process of science. And if you pick apart that document, it kind of conjures up this image of this army of rational, kind of scientifically inclined robots that are in high-skilled jobs, and they're all making rational decisions and talking to each other in completely rational terms. And so it's kind of it's almost, I don't know if you think it's Victorian, Kate, but it's kind of this idea that, you know, we can improve the general population if we can just get them talking in scientific means and take all of that emotion out. We don't need to worry about these low-skilled jobs that are disappearing because everybody can be CAD designers. The second one, I think, comes from the work of Calon, who talks about the fact that the more technology comes through the market, the more spillovers we get. So we have technology that gets introduced in science, and it often has unexpected consequences. And as members of the public, we all have to navigate and be able to deal with those and try and understand where they come from. So I think I would encapsulate that as it's not that you need to go and find scientific citizenship, but it's going to come to you anyway. And so how you deal with it, how equipped you are to deal with that is a question of how well you can play your part in this environment that we now live in. And then the last one, the last strand that I picked up comes from Jasanoff, who talks about a lot of the kind of technologically based crises that we've had, these canonical ones about, you know, BSE and MMR, where publics react in unexpected ways, or they are they're not as embracing of new kinds of technologies, or they don't focus solely on safety and raise other concerns. And Jasanoff kind of has this idea that that these are now so significant that they are reordering the relationships between science and society and institutions. And so there is something going on now that's different because of the amount of science and technology and the amount that it pervades our lives. There is something going on that reorders the way that these institutions work with one another. So they're kind of the three areas that you might start to think about scientific citizenship coming from, why we need to talk about it in those terms. Page down. So the first, I think if you do a reading of some of the public engagement, public understanding of science literature, the first kind of visualization that you get of scientific citizenship is this move from public understanding of science or a deficit model of communication towards dialogue. And this is often like this is the democratic turn. You know, we now have something in place through these different kinds of dialogues that we do that is a qualitatively different experience for the public. And so when we talk about deficit model type communication, we're often talking about a unidirectional movement of knowledge from an expert to relatively homogeneous mass of people to educate them, to enthuse them, to inspire them, which is okay, but then that is expected to produce some sort of behavioural or attitudinal change, and that's where it starts to get a little bit more difficult to demonstrate. But that's the general idea, and that is still very, very pervasive around science and technology. Really hope that that's something that we can come back to talk to in depth later, because I've still not quite got the right answer about what that is really all about. There's not really much of an idea that the only kind of feedback that you get from the public might be for clarification questions. So it's very much kind of, you know, the knowledge is embodied in one place and it's being moved to another place. Whereas dialogue is a lot more about governance, and so there's an idea that I have some form of expertise, a technological expertise, maybe a policy expertise, and you have some sort of lay expertise, and you might be seen to represent somebody else who is like you. Maybe other people who are the same colour as you, or the same age as you, or the same demographic profile as you. And so you come into a room and talk to me, and in some way you're representing other people. And we talk about some of these issues to do with science and technology. And we've had, in the UK, this is kind of administered through ScienceWise, a lot of the flagship dialogue projects, not all of them. There are some that are run by government departments, but ScienceWise is the expert resource centre in dialogue. And so the mental model says that you have consulted with the public in some way. So the word consulting is worth thinking about because it's quite it has extractive connotations, you know. Are you really kind of listening to what people are saying, or are you just trying to get bits of data out of them so that you can then go and use it on your own terms in your own way? I don't want to spend an hour pulling apart critiques of kind of dialogue, but I just wanted to raise the idea that there is so much critique of public dialogues that I think you can fairly comfortably say that it's not quite the democratic step that it is portrayed to be. It's still highly problematic. Yeah, we did some work on that last year, Which Publics When, talking about for ScienceWise, led by Alison Moore, Sujata Raman and me, and looking at the different kinds of publics in public engagement, how we can break apart the way that this idea of representativeness and perhaps get more fluidity into the public of public dialogues. So that's kind of two ideas of citizenship. One of them is that it's a deficit model-based thing, and another one is a dialogue-based thing. So that kind of gets us into this idea about thinking about different exercises of citizenship, different things we can do in order to kind of use our expertise or capacity as citizens. Okay? We can be dialogic or we can be recipient. This is kind of, so if we start to think about rights and responsibilities in terms of citizenship, this isn't the only attribute that I'll do, but it's kind of convenient to do it right now. And you can start to draw out what might be inferred from these different models of participation. And so there is, if you think about the deficit model, where somebody might be telling you about some photovoltaic cell or a bit of electrochemistry or whatever, then there's an idea that you have the right to know, and we'll come back to that later, this idea of the right to know and ideas of accountability. And that you can be, as lay people, we can expect that to be communicated to us in clear, unambiguous terms that we can understand. There's an onus on somebody else to do that. But then in return, we're kind of expected to listen to that and to listen with reason, and there is an idea that we would trust formal expertise above other sources of expertise. So I'm just trying to tease out what some of these attributes might be around these different models. Whereas for dialogic citizens, it's expected that we have a voice that you don't have in the deficit model, and that you, as somebody, will represent your interests or your embodiment in that dialogic process. Whereas you have a responsibility to be a data source. You're supposed to turn up and do what you're supposed to do and participate in the right way. And there is also an inbuilt idea in dialogue that consensus is a valuable and achievable thing. And sadly, I can't talk about that for an hour, which I'd love to do. But it is definitely there in that idea of public dialogue that consensus is achievable around science and technology as long as we talk about it enough. People of the internet going bananas right now. So another idea then, so let's move on from deficit and dialogue, and let's think about citizens co-creating science. So citizen science, or perhaps through their bodies in clinical trials, and here the public has a right to contribute, and they have a recognised expertise. Now, what form that expertise is and how much is expected kind of depends on what kind of model of co-creation you're going for. So it might be that you just act as a censor. You know, you might be some bird-watching person in Orkney who's part of a big survey, or you might actually be in there in the process of science saying, why are you doing that, what's kind of happening, what research priorities should we have. And so there is a responsibility, an inferred responsibility, that you would offer something of yourself there. So then I look at the proliferation of informal science engagement and think, right, okay then, so what's that about? There's this huge literature on science, a little bit on science festivals, loads on science centres, even more on science museums. But then if you just look about and see what's happening, you'll see that there is a vast amount of energy being spent on informal science engagement. I mean, there are new techniques that come up all the time. And so what is it that people are doing there? And I think that there is an idea that as an individual member of the public, you have the right to experience science on kind of cultural grounds, I think, really. It's a leisure activity. And you often have to pay, and you would go along and do it instead of perhaps some other leisure activity that you might be doing. And so really you are just acting as a consumer there. I mean, some of these things can be very expensive. It is... yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to have a debate about why I think that is a consumption activity above anything else. And I don't say that in a critical way, by the way, as you'll see when I come on to that. But there is a readiness to engage effectively, and I think that's really important about informal science engagement, is that it's not just an exercise of the brain and cognition and understanding. It's about emotion. You're supposed to have fun. You're supposed to enjoy it. You're supposed to find it stimulating. Maybe the environment is fun, or it's interactive in some way. And then finally, the other kind of node that I want to look at is when publics organise themselves. And so we're talking about activism and counterpublics, when people get involved in emotive arguments. They don't want to play by the rules. They want to reframe things in different ways. If you think about GM and trashing crop trials, or protesting about wind farms, or scaling chimneys at coal power stations, these kinds of activities are where a counter-public has been mobilised by somebody, often a civil society organisation, and you get the right to choose your allegiance. Your allegiance doesn't always have to be to the state or to the dominant frame. It can be to somebody else. And when we'll come on to look at biomass, where people in Scotland, where people have said, you know, actually it's not about this energy that we're producing here, it's about this very distant public a long way away, and we want to bring them into view now by saying you're deforesting their area, deforest them just so that you can access some subsidy here. And so there's an idea there, quite a clear idea, I think, of citizenship there, in that you are acting to speak up for some broader public in the common good. But often that comes with a personal commitment, that being a member of the counterpublic often involves spending large amounts of time finding information, putting information together, enrolling other people. You might put yourself in the way of arrest or public critique. So just to recap for that section there, so that was kind of drawn largely from literature about how publics engage with science and what we might infer about citizenship. We looked at receptive groups of people, dialogic, co-creators, consumers and counterpublics. Okay? Right. So when I came to think about how I was going to handle the data and what I was going to look for, I had to decide what this thing called citizenship was, where I was going to draw that from, and what kind of idea I was going to go for. And so I went for this kind of fairly static view of, well, it kind of comes from political citizenship, doesn't it? It's quite Greco-Roman. So more recently, citizenship has come to be talked about in terms of equal legal status, whereas kind of if you look further back, it's about equal rights to participation, and that's kind of where I wanted to be, because obviously a lot of the data and the most visible work that we can see around science and technology is about modes of participation, and so I was fairly comfortable with that. And so I used these three, this triumvirate, as Beverly calls it, of citizenship. And I say that it took me about 18 months to get to this point, this little triangle, and because these quite abstract concepts can be quite difficult to apply when you're looking at, when you're sitting there doing an observation, right? So the first bit is about membership and belonging, and so that really is about, that's the bit that science and technology struggles with most, I think. I think that, you know, we can kind of pick out what rights and responsibilities there might be. We're really good at looking at modes of participation, how to get people involved with science and technology, and then we can look at okay, what is it we're expecting from them? What is it that we're offering? Which is quite difficult because we often don't articulate that. The bit that we really don't understand is this idea of membership and belonging. And when it's political membership, it's easy because it's often allied to a geopolitical terrain. You know, the country, your mode of participation might be to vote. So if we think about membership and belonging in the context of science and technology, what does that mean? How can you apply ideas of membership and belonging across a terrain of science and technology? And so to answer that, I go to Norton Maris's work about issues creating publics. And so I think that the idea of a public around a science and technology, which is what membership and belonging is for me, it's kind of it's an identity issue, it's about groups of people coming together, then you have to look at what the issue is that's bringing them together, or how they are being imagined by the sponsor. So that's kind of the structure that I use. And so essentially, as I went through my empirical work, I developed this framework that had these different nodes of citizenship, and I analysed different kind of aspects of it. I'm not going to populate that for you because you don't need to know. I'm just trying to explain the process that I went through. And so if you're more policy inclined, you'll be thinking, oh, okay then, so membership is about the who, rights and responsibilities are about the why and the how, and modes of participation are about the what. Yeah? Right, okay, so I just want to turn now to Scotland, which is where I did the work. So Scotland is... everybody been to Scotland? Yeah, you all been? Great. Anybody not been? It's awesome. Look, you've all been. It's amazing. Has anybody not been to Edinburgh? It's... so energy is symbolically hugely important to Scotland. North Sea oil's been really important economic feature since the 1970s, particularly as other heavy industry in Scotland has reduced shipbuilding and heavy engineering, that kind of work. It also has a lot of resources. It's got 2/3 of the EU's proven oil resources, 1/8 of the gas, 70% of the UK coal. It's often quoted as having the highest natural resources in the UK in terms of tidal power, wind power, wave power, those kinds of availability for natural resources. And the Scottish National Party kind of made this a flagship project that they would transfer, well, not dependency, but they would complement the oil availability with renewable energy. And so they introduced Climate Change Scotland Act when it was before they had a majority, which is recognised quite widely as the strongest climate legislation in the world. And the kind of symbolic stories that go with this are about energy security, emissions reduction, job creation in urban areas, and what's really important is job creation in rural areas in Scotland. And wave and tidal power gives you the opportunity to say, you know, actually we can get some jobs working on the coast, or, you know, kind of on the islands and in the Highlands. However, the other part of this context is that more than 1/3 of Scottish households are classified as being fuel poor, they're in fuel poverty. It's a wide-scale problem in the UK, just as much in Scotland, and the growth of renewable energy to the UK grid has not reduced fuel bills. They've doubled over the last 8 years because oil prices have gone up, savings have not been passed on to customers. I know that this is a really, really live issue still at the moment, and it is an issue, and the renewables obligation that energy companies have to pay has been passed on to customers. I'm just thinking while I'm pausing. So we have talked about ideas of citizenship. We kind of know all this stuff about public engagement and about how we can bring publics and science and technology together. And then we have this massive societal scale technological transformation going on in Scotland. So surely you would expect that the science communication and the public engagement infrastructure around Scotland would be geared up to help deliver this decarbonisation strategy. Is that what you would think would happen? Yes. Okay, so I genuinely thought that's what was going to happen. I thought that I was going to go up to Scotland and I would turn up at Scottish Government and they would all say, oh yeah, what we're doing for the decarbonisation agenda is this, because it was such a huge, huge issue. Well, I mean, I obviously won't keep you in suspense, but that's not what happened at all. So the climate change legislation did have a line in there saying that there had to be a public engagement strategy. And that was produced kind of at the 11th hour, this little book that came out. Low Carbon Scotland Public Engagement Strategy, which basically listed all of the individual projects that were going on. So it didn't kind of add a lot of value. And interestingly, this was published before I started my fieldwork. Never, ever found anybody prepared to take responsibility for it. So I've never interviewed anybody about this because nobody wrote it. And it was criticised really, really quickly on the grounds that there was no consultative process, that nobody was involved in it, and that it's not very public, and it was just not, there was no vision in it, there were no new ideas about how people would get involved. So yeah, it was right, people talked about it as a box-ticking exercise that just had to be done because it was in the Act, and so it got produced and was a kind of hugely missed opportunity, really. But that's where this all should have been, shouldn't it? I mean, all of this public engagement expertise and, you know, the Beltane, you would have thought they would have written that. I think Beltane were coming online at the same time, to be fair, but there are very active universities in Scotland who were doing public engagement, so, you know, one wonders where they all were. And the Royal Society of Edinburgh and Royal Geographical Society. There's lots of kind of actors there that you would expect to be involved. And so I guess there's a question there about how much you can seize that agenda. You know, if you are in the business of producing science and technology and you have an interest in public engagement, then do you wait for somebody to invite you into the process to make a contribution, or do you actually say, you know, actually this country that I'm living in, that I'm part of, this is the social problem that we're facing, and so I want to get involved in that. Whose responsibility is it to make that happen? Matt, that's a question we'll come back to. Right, so just fieldwork. So I took a really, really heterogeneous data set. It's not kind of a thematic analysis project. It was a pattern matching thing. So I wanted to look really, really broadly across a really wide context and say, okay then, so does this look like what the literature says it's going to look like? Can I see citizenship here? What does it say about public engagement? And so I did a couple of dozen elite interviews with policymakers around land use and public engagement and the low carbon transition, developers, intermediaries like science centres, science festivals, people who stood up and did public engagement, Café Scientifique organisers, activists, civil society organisations like Church of Scotland. I did participant observation at science centres, festivals, Café Scientifique, to kind of sit there and say, okay, what am I supposed to be doing here as a visitor? What's the experience I'm supposed to be having? Am I supposed to do anything? I did some visits to commercial venues like the Electric Garage in Scotland, Whiteley Wind Farm Visitor Centre, and then as a bit of a triangulation measure, I had chats with members of the public. So at no point do I claim to speak for any member of the public. That's not what this project was about. But while I was there with them, I would say to 6 at every event, hi, I'm doing a project, what are you doing here? What other kind of things do you do in your spare time? How did you come to be here? Just to check that nothing new kind of flagged up to make me think, oh, I've missed that, you know. So, what did I find? So I'm going to tackle this through these three aspects of the triangle, and I'm going to pick out the core sort of things that I noticed, the things that kind of bubble up to the surface. And so you'll see that there is some match in some parts onto the framework, but there is not ever a total match of what you might call a fully rounded expression of citizenship. I think that's fair. So in terms of membership, the kind of easiest things that you can find are, and there will be no surprise here, a public to be enthused. And so there are lots and lots of activities and lots of instances where you go along and you are there to be impressed by science. And there is an expert there, and the event will be, so I remember one event at Edinburgh Science Festival, and it was Dr. Bunhead Sock the scientist, and I sat in the audience, and there was this guy called Dr. Bunhead. I think I was supposed to know who he was, but I didn't, and he had a white coat and everything, and we had socks and we had to throw them at, anyway, it got thrown about to decide who asked the question, but they'd collect the questions in threes, and so the scientist at the front didn't ever have to answer a question he didn't want to ask. And so there was a panel, and so he would say, right, you've got a question on this, this, and this, and they could choose which one of the questions they answered. So we couldn't possibly have a situation where the scientist would say, I don't know, or I can't speak for all science. That just kind of, the event was designed so that that couldn't happen. And so I think, but people do this in droves. I mean, so many people do. They're going to science festivals, and they clearly love it. I went to Wonders of the Universe with St Brian at the Lothian Theatre in Edinburgh, and it was a full-size screening of his Wonders of the Universe programme, which was great to see in the cinema. And then it was question and answer at the end, and so he sat up on the stage at the end with Robin Ince, like that, and people could just ask questions in the audience, and so there was a lot of giggling, you know, from the ladies and some of the men, and everybody was very impressed that Brian was there. And one guy stood up and said, hello Brian, I'm a hairdresser and I don't know anything about science, and so I'm so grateful to you that my 12-year-old daughter has got someone like you to look up to. And there's quite a lot of that goes on, this idea that we're kind of so grateful that these celebrities kind of come out and share their amazing knowledge with us. And so there is kind of, so my point here is that there is still plenty of evidence through the idea that not only that we have lots of participation where we have an expert and a grateful audience, but that people love it. They love it. They like doing it. They pay to do it. I mean, that I think that was like £10 a ticket, something like that, which is not trivial. But clearly that's an expression of culture to me. I mean, that is like going to the cinema. It's like going to a play. It is no different to that. And actually, I think that's what one of the great strengths of this kind of science communication is that it kind of gets critiqued because it doesn't stretch far into the democratic sphere. But actually what it does do is position science from being something that is exotic and happens behind closed doors and might be a bit scary if it involves Petri dishes, into being something that can be, that you can go and do on a Friday evening and then kind of drop into conversation on the next date that you go on. And so I think it's really useful to kind of bring science into culture, into cinemas, into kind of public buildings. And so Café Scientifique also does a great job of that. So the second one is kind of public as consumers. And so science and technology studies kind of has a bit of a problematic relationship with consumption and the market and consumers. And there are really valid critiques there. I mean, if you're going to see people only in terms of what resources they can give you, which often means money, then people are going to be excluded from that. But then equally, they will get excluded from all of these other things too. They might not be prepared to go to walk into a university building to go to a public lecture. I mean, I know that you had Emily Dawson here not long ago talking about kind of invisible modes of exclusion, so I won't go over that, but it's, you know, consumption is not the only way in which people get excluded, and actually can be a really valid way of people taking political action and forming an identity and starting to come together around some issues. And I'll come back to the electric garage on this later. But also, if you look at the first generation of science festivals that have happened in Scotland, they're clearly kind of consumer type activities. I mean, they're not cheap. You know, when I went out, I must have spent about 100 quid on tickets for going to just different kinds of events. And I mean, it's not what I choose to spend my money on, to be honest. But people kind of get a kick out of doing that. That's kind of what they build their identity around. They can tell people that they go to science festivals, and then they can sit and talk amongst each other. And so there is a process there of facilitating the formation of an identity. And so I kind of started to look at some of these activities, and I thought, I don't kind of recognise any of these things at all. I wouldn't go to any of these science communication things for fun. I don't know anybody that does these kinds of things. My dad wouldn't go, my sister wouldn't be able to afford to go, and so who is it that they're for? And that was when I started to look quite broadly around different ways that people did get involved in science and technology. And obviously when you start to look at energy, one of the and kind of other areas too, one of the areas where people we can most see a coalescence of a public is around a counterpublic. So when a technology becomes material enough to be problematic, then you can get a public forming around it that want to put things in a different way. And when we only talk about science in the abstract, that doesn't happen because there is nothing at stake there, is there? If we want to talk about, so having a conversation about how far away Jupiter is a different conversation from, do you know how much it costs to keep the International Space Station in orbit, and is that what you would choose to spend your money on? And so the problem with these kinds of, the problem with some of the more abstract discursive types of engagement is that there's just not enough to get going around a discussion and to start to form some of the publics that might rise up in opposition. So this is so this is kind of the pro Donald Trump group in Scotland who don't like offshore wind. So this is a counterpublic. Right, rights and responsibilities. So there are kind of few things that started to emerge there. The first one that's really obvious is that everybody seems to accept now that we have a right to know. That as a member of the public, I have a right to know what it is that you're doing with that £500,000 research budget. But in return for that, I'm expected to carry on being quite happy paying tax so that you can keep doing it. And there is a bit of an inference that I'm supposed to listen to what you say and kind of go and do something positive with that. But when I talk to people who are involved in engagement, they use this language of accountability, which was quite new to me. We have to be accountable, they said. And I've kind of worked around accountability before, and I say, well, what does that mean? And they say, well, people have a right to know what we're doing. And you say, so do they have a right to say anything about that? Oh, God, no. And that's where the title from this talk came from. And so I was having a conversation with an organiser of an informal science engagement event. I'm not going to say any more than that because I haven't got permission to use this quote, which I should. And said, why is it that you run this event? And this person said, because the public have a right to know what we're doing, because we're accountable to them, because they pay their taxes. And I said, so do you think that they have a right to say anything about what it is that you do? Do you think that they can usefully talk about what kinds of research should be done? And the person said, no, that would be like asking a child to drive a bus. And then somebody else that I spoke to in the same city said, no, I want the public to know what we're doing, but I think that they have to leave scientists to make these decisions. And in fact, they should give us a free rein, really, because we're the ones that know what it is that need to be done. And so, you know, kind of still a very, so this language of accountability is not matched by anything more than diffusion. The second kind of area that you see bubbling up in rights and responsibilities is this idea of the right to choose. And so you don't kind of see people saying, oh, you know, you must do this, or you must kind of go to these kind of events, or we're going to integrate them into your life in some way that they're unavoidable. There is always the idea that you can select into these things. And so there's a lot of language around opportunities, learning opportunities and lifelong learning opportunities. And, you know, we're here and we will be available to you, but what we have to do is induce you to come and kind of choose to take advantage of those opportunities. And that's kind of where some of this idea of consumption comes in, and cultural citizenship, that's what you would start to form your identity around, an issue that you're particularly interested in. And so the role of business comes in here, is that the problem is that that right is not matched with a responsibility. So it might be okay to say, okay, we're going to deliver a low carbon agenda through the market, and we're going to do that through green tariffs, and we're going to do that through electric cars. But if you choose not to take advantage of any of those, there is no payback on that. So you get the choice, but it's one of those things where we haven't yet facilitated any way of having any responsibility around it, in my opinion. I'll be interested to know whether you kind of agree with that. And then the last area is this right to reframe. And so if somebody tells you that, you know, wind turbines are actually all about reducing emissions, then you have the right to say they're not about reducing emissions, they're actually about subsidy. And so I'm going to tell everybody this story about subsidy that I've been and learned, I've found out, and I'm going to tell you about that, and I'm also going to tell you about where this stuff really comes from, and the fact that we're mining heavy metals in China and that's causing a huge amount of pollution, or the fact that we are deforesting areas in South America just so that we can burn them in Leith. And these, so there is a strong kind of idea that you will reframe that, but then in return for that, there is an inference that you would be expected to act rationally. And of course, when people don't do that, the science policy establishment find it difficult to cope with. And if you look at the trashing of GM crop trials, that's a particular one. There is a real head-to-head about, well, we don't want this, and we can just walk in there. We will take this risk. We're going to go in there and we're going to scrap the trial. And then scientists will say, but if you don't let us develop the data, then we're never going to be able to answer these questions that you've got. And so then person A will say, but you're not asking the same questions as I'm asking anyway, and I'm not interested in the answers that you're trying to produce. It's just a way of kind of further establishing it. And so these kind of head-to-heads are, it seems to me, and I'll make the argument that it comes from the materiality of technology, that they are inescapable, is that you will get to the point, as soon as you start to introduce something that is a product that you're not talking about in the abstract, that you have it here, you have to decide what shape it is, where it's going to go, then you have what Chantal Mouffe calls an inescapable moment of decision. And talk of consensus around that is a little bit illusory. You can only do that. And upstream kind of governance, you can only do that before things become material. As soon as they become material, people will disagree, and there will be an inescapable moment of decision, and that will always be a political phase. There is no escape from that. So here's some people protesting about the Leith biomass plant. So modes of participation, which was the last bit of our triangle of citizenship. What came up there? Okay then, so we'll see this again, sender receiver. So where I'm going to talk to you about might be global warming. I went to one about the, I went to hear John Horton, who used to be, is it chair of the IPCC? And I think he's a Christian, and he did an invited talk with the Church of Scotland as part of the Edinburgh Science Festival. And he talked about us being guardians of the planet. It was framed very much for that audience, and they loved it, until somebody in the audience stood up and said, I've got a problem with the hockey stick scenario. And there was like a pantomime boo that anybody had kind of critiqued. I'd challenged any of what John Horton was saying, or it was like, oh, we don't do politics here. We're all kind of loving the planet. And so often those kinds of talks can be very discursive and abstract and depoliticised, which is, you know, I mean, what is it that you're trying to achieve there? How much can you engage people if you depoliticise everything and you can't talk about anything concrete and you're not prepared to talk about the politics of things? Another mode of participation is using products. And so the electric garage in Glasgow has, it's run by Scottish and Southern Energy, and it has free electric car parking, car charging points if you happen to have an electric vehicle, both of you in Glasgow, I imagine. But you can hire out electric vehicles for the day to go sightseeing so that you can give them a try, learn how they work. You can hire them for an hour to drive around the city. And there is a visitor centre as you walk in there that's been developed by Glasgow Science Centre. And so it talks about renewable energy and where some of the energy comes from that goes into charging the vehicles. And so there's clearly kind of, obviously SSE are trying to extend their market there, but they access people that wouldn't go and pay £10 to walk into Glasgow Science Centre, which, by the way, doesn't have any other, or at the time, didn't have any exhibits on renewable energy. The only place it had any energy exhibits was in the electric garage. And also it has exhibits up at Whiteley Wind Farm Visitor Centre. So the only way that you could get the Science Centre's kind of expertise on renewable energy was through commercial outlets. Whiteley Wind Farm is run by the other energy company up there. Yeah, anyway. But also products act as a mediating tool. And so I went and talked to some people who work for cooperatives and housing associations and said, you know, how are you dealing with climate change? And they said, well, we don't talk about climate change. That's for starters. We certainly don't talk about carbon. So this was talking to a carbon manager. Never used the word carbon. We go in and we talk to people about, are they warm enough? And can they afford to pay their bills? And that's the basis on which they talk to people. And so some of the, so you knock on the door, no, I'm not interested. Are you from the landlord? Are you from the council? That kind of thing. And so what they found was, so in two different cases actually, one of them was using thermographic surveys. And so they would knock on the door and say, we'd really like to do a thermographic survey and we'll find the cold spots in your house, in your flat, and we'll help you warm them up so that you're not feeling so cold. And so that's kind of the mediating tool. A material kind of piece of technology becomes the means by which you can get past the front door into the house and talk to people about what kind of energy they're using. And then you can say, do you keep the TV on standby? Do you, have you got a, what's the rating of your white goods? Maybe we can help you out with this grant scheme here that we've got. And the other one was through energy monitors. And so the cooperative was using energy monitors to do exactly the same job. So a piece of material technology as a mediating tool. And Norton Maris has written on this as well. There was a special edition in Science, Technology and Human Values, I think, on technology as mediating tools. But in energy, as part of energy, one of the biggest modes of participation is around the planning system because it's all about land use. And I think there's such a blind spot between technology and land use in this country is that we just kind of don't see that as part of the public engagement landscape. But it is. It is. How we use land is where people start to get engaged with these kind of issues. Here is kind of the complete opposite to sender-receiver modes. Very material, we're talking about a specific design. It's very political because people know who's on the council, who's making the decisions. People will come into opposition about the graphics and the visualization that get used around planning systems. You know, you've put that wind turbine in, but you've made it too light a grey, and so it looks invisible on the graphic. These are the kind of discussions that people are having here. But there is a question there about people getting involved at the right time. So often when somebody proposes that they're going to put some wind turbines up near them, that's already a decision that was made in the spatial plan that happened 18 months before. And so the challenge is getting the people who will become mobilised to become mobilised earlier at a stage where they can say, right, actually, okay, we will have some renewable energy here, but this is where we want it to come from. I mean, that's your kind of ideal scenario. But when you start to look more closely at what happens in the planning system, you can start to resolve some of these questions around renewable energy. And so I saw a talk a while ago calling renewable energy in the public in the UK a democratic paradox, because people say they want renewable energy, but then when it comes down to it, they all seem to oppose it. And this was put forward, so political theorists put forward that this is a case of cheap talk. People will sign up to things that don't cost them anything. And I have some sympathy with that, but then when it comes down to it, they don't want it anymore. I think it's a question of materiality. I think that people do want renewable energy, and they are prepared to negotiate. Not all people, obviously, but it depends where it's going to go. It depends how big it's going to be. It depends where that energy is going to go, whether, you know, what the cumulative impact of different schemes is. So my theme here is saying, In engagement, we need to think about materiality. It has a massive effect on the process, the outcome, and what it is that you think you can achieve. And then the last one, it was a really interesting one, is around Church of Scotland, who do a lot of work. They have a science, technology and religion project and do deep pieces of thought work around issues like cloning, use of embryos, as well as they're part of the Eco Congregations project. They have carbon reduction targets for all of their congregations, and they have developed the Church of Scotland position on renewable energy and the low carbon economy. And that's particularly important in Scotland, they tell me, because they're so far from Westminster. They have had a kind of active debating sphere that the Church of Scotland is an active part of. And so what they say is actually quite important, and they do engage fully in issues of science and technology. And so there's a little bit of dialogue in there in talking directly to policymakers, and they claim credit they claim partial credit for the climate change targets being so aggressive. They really pushed to encourage that. And they say that they were instrumental in that. And partly epistemic, because they do put a lot of work into developing positions that will have some longevity, that they can sit with for kind of 5 years. And so there's an interesting piece of epistemic work going on there in terms of new knowledge positions. So that's my 3. This is the electric garage. I kind of loved it there. It was great. So it's kind of interesting when you do a participant observation at a science festival, something that you find quite boring, and then you go into a place that's got loads of bits of cool technology that you want to have a go in. I find that you kind of had a long discussion with my supervisor about quite how much emotion and effect I was able to put into the fieldwork notes about that. So the other thing that I wanted to mention pretty much as a wrap-up really is this idea of bringing science communication and engagement infrastructure into direct contact with the social requirements. And so just thinking now about, so I've kind of picked apart ideas of citizenship and engagement in the context of a national transformation. So what happens kind of in cities? Can we scale that down? How would we go about saying, okay then, so if we want science engagement to be about more than just talking to people and telling them what we're doing, if we want to use our expertise and our infrastructure to help address social problems, how would we do that? And Open Places is an EU-run project. Is anybody familiar with Open Places? So you know it. It's brilliant, right? It's called Place of Scientific Culture. And so what it does is that it links up cities, the science infrastructure in cities with the local government. And they come together and they say, so what are the issues here and how can we come together? And so Glasgow has a theme of improving lives, because an issue in Glasgow is life expectancy. It's the males in Glasgow have the lowest life expectancy of anywhere in the UK. And so headed up by the Glasgow Science Centre, but also representing all of the other informal science mechanisms that go around it, they talk to the city and say, okay, then what can we actually do about this together? You know, this is our problem in our city, what can we do about it? So there's some online stuff there that you might want to look at, Anne. And we have one in Nottingham, actually. So Nottingham is a city that's got 2 universities, and part of the problem is that all of the jobs get taken by the undergraduates that come in, and so the local teenagers can't find employment because they're not as articulate, and the competition for the kind of jobs that they might want to do is too great. And so the city council is really interested in saying, okay, then what can we do about raising the expectations of our teenagers? That's how John Ray puts it. It's like, you know, how do we get them to think, if they're not going to be part of this university environment, how can we get them to expect more of their own lives? And how can the universities kind of help us achieve that? So I just wanted to flag up the Open Places project, and I wanted to stop there for a bit of discussion. This is from the NCCPE. Have you all seen this? It's just a model of kind of stakeholders. I mean, it's just to kind of prompt some discussion, really. Because I put on the abstract that I sent round, there are a lot of questions on there. So this is kind of what I think. And so my first question is, why is it that we have a really lively public engagement, science communication landscape, and yet it seems completely disjointed from social priorities and public policy? Because that's what I saw in Scotland. We had this big transformation that was going on that had a lot of social impact on it. Why is it that the science communication Why is it that the public engagement infrastructure is not talking to that? So that's question one. The other one is, how can, so two big questions and then we can maybe have a discussion. The second one is, how, as a kind of key facilitator in this kind of space, how does a university get more social impact from the public engagement work that it does? Above and beyond making sure that the right people are included, how do you make sure that you ask the right questions? How do you do more than just tell people what you do? So I'm hoping we can actually discuss some of those things.
Shall I just start? Shall I just start by saying something then?
Okay.
So, first question, which I can't quite remember, but I think I remember roughly what you said.
Okay, thank you.
Roughly what the question is. Anyway, so I came at science communication as a practitioner 25, 30 years ago or something, and I've been doing that. And I never even thought about research or researching it, and I have a degree in science initially. So, but I didn't come at science communication because I thought that the public was stupid and needed to have their heads filled with science. Neither did I come at it because I thought these are things that citizens need to know because they don't know them and they can't be properly in society to take part. I came at it totally as an arts exercise. I came at it as a storytelling exercise, as an exercise in entertainment. And so I think that most of the public informal, what you call informal public engagement that you have observed, is not science communication. It's just part of culture. It's an arts exercise. It's about broadening people's cultures. It's about giving people cultural touchstones. It's about creating representations and experiences that are thinking tools, that are cultural thinking tools. And to me, that's just the same as if you go to see, you know, Shakespeare's Henry V, as it is if you go to see Brian Watson. And quite interesting as well, when I did my research actually was on 19th century popular stories and how scientific thought influenced the shape of narrative. But in the 19th century, science became a kind of real middle-class cultural kind of mark and a marker for those people who were middle-class and intellectual and witty and fashionable. And it was not ever considered as an exercise to make sure that people could take part in society. Apart from, well, I won't go into that because I was Proliferation. There was a movement to do that, which related to some other things that you were saying about local to take over. So I don't know. So the main thing I'm saying is, I think a lot of what we talk about as science communication has nothing to do with real political issues like, am I going to be able to pay my fuel bills and will there be a huge turbine about 50 feet from the house? What it has to do with is entertaining people and allowing them to take part in culture just in the same way as does, you know, series like The Killing and Sherlock Holmes and Shakespeare and art gallery. So I don't know if anybody has thoughts.
So is there something special about science then? I guess that's the obvious question that comes from that. I mean, is this the same as going to a play? Is it, or is there something really special about science?
That was what comes out of that question. You need the word scientific and the word citizenship. Is kind of what you're saying. If you take the word scientific out of it and say, we just need some kind of connection between what we're trying to do as knowledge producers, if you like, and citizenship. Is that actually a more fruitful way of thinking about it? I mean, your wind turbine isn't just about science, do you know what I mean? There are
Absolutely.
things going on, do you know what I mean? You need to be, and that's where that kind of demarcation between the kind of Victorian VUS model is kind of reinforced, because you just say, okay, it's a nice kind of privileged kind of form of knowledge, therefore we need to stick that word scientific in front of citizenship. And that, in a way, is the problem. If you take that away and just say, actually, we're all citizens.
Yeah, so citizenship I mean, I don't know if you can comment more on this, Nick. Is not very good at handling questions of materiality. Like Science and Society, citizenship is often described in very discursive terms. It's something that we talk about, they're kind of concepts. We don't talk a lot about the way that people participate beyond voting. And as soon as you do start to look at that, people kind of pull apart this idea that citizens have got more passive over time because voting kind of levels have reduced. And actually, when you do start to pay attention to what it is that people are doing, and you know, with their hands and with bits of paper or the clicks of a mouse, you see that actually lots of other forms of action are taking place, which are kind of compensating for that. But it's a kind of this idea of citizen politics is a bit of an emerging kind of field, really, I think. Yeah, but whether you need the word science in there depends how much you buy into that first slide about these three. You know, what kind of shaping force do you think science has on society? Do you think that it kind of fundamentally reorders the relationship between civil society and business and government? Or do you think it's just another thing that we do like the arts?
I was struck by your, at the start, you do your desk, you do your dialogue. Instinctively, I was expecting you to then do, Alan Irwin's kind of contextual.
Do what, sorry?
Alan Irwin's kind of contextual model on the end, which does kind of make this thing more symmetrical. You didn't do that, which was quite interesting. So I think that to me takes the scientific off the front of citizenship and says actually, you're bringing science to the table, do you know what I mean? Therefore, it's more of a kind of symmetrical discussion about different forms of knowledge and what do we actually want to do here before we get to that inescapable moment of decision.
I love that.
It's a really nice phrase.
Yeah, it's good. I like her work a lot, actually. So, I mean, that kind of, that original framing about what does science have to say about equality, power, belonging, that comes straight from Alan Irwin's Citizen Science. And that book is like 20 years old, and yet that I don't feel that is a thread of scholarship that's got anywhere near as much kind of recognition as it has, as it should. I mean, that's just kind of my personal view. I wouldn't justify that with a literature review, but I think often science and technology studies are so focused on the science that it kind of doesn't step back and ask these questions about, well, what is special about science? But that thing about whether science is part of culture or how is science part of culture, really interesting, because it's something that came up during the field work as I talked to particularly organisers of science festivals who often reported, so I think I talked to the 5 big science festivals in Scotland, who often reported a problem in getting buy-in to the cultural activities happening in local authorities and city councils. And so often city councils might have like a cultural, like a committee that sit around and talk about book festivals and literature festivals. You can never get on there as a scientist, as a representative of a science centre. And this was kind of an ongoing theme that they were not seen to be part of culture. And I said, so what are you seen as being? And they didn't really know. I think there's a bit of a guess that science is seen as a facilitator of business, and so it's not part of culture.
I think there's something in that is to do with the way that science communication has been kind of siloed off, I suppose, as something different. I mean, we don't worry about the public understanding of Shakespeare. No one's ever, you either understand it or you don't, and those people who understand it and like it, fantastic. And those who don't, they don't. We don't worry about it. Now, science, I think, is special in many ways. I'm not saying that it's not, but in this context of communicating in an entertaining way, where Dr. Bunhead or whatever it was throwing socks, that's about having a good time. That's about joining in a culture, and part of the culture is science. But I think literary people are very suspicious of. In fact, I had a very interesting, because my PhD crossed, I went to literary conferences and I went to some science communication conferences. And in the States, I met one class of people, because in the States, at the beginning of your degree, you have to take a wide range of topics. And scientists, they said, were always very open to doing the art subjects, but the art students who had to do science absolutely hated and loathed it. So there is some issue that art people have
About science.
and I think it is something as well to do with the claim that science has to special knowledge, and I mean actually I think it probably is in some ways, but it's certainly different.
Your original question, your first question was, if I remember correctly, was why isn't science communication or engagement more prevalent in these big issues? Is that what you said?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, that's close enough.
I mean, for me, the reason why people don't care as much about, but don't need to communicate about Shakespeare as much as they do about science, is, I mean, because I come from more of a risk-based approach with governance and government decision making and risk-based environmental decisions. And science becomes the rationale of why you allocate resources. And these resources are money and time that you would otherwise use for healthcare, for example, and stuff like that. So I think that's the reason why you have to communicate science, because...
But those aren't the bits of science that are being communicated in these science festivals. The science festivals communicate, cool stuff. Like Shakespeare.
You like
They
Shakespeare?
don't, I mean, nobody, and all the time I've done science communication, we don't communicate that sort of thing because we are culturally based and we're an entertainment industry.
And I'm about to start too hazy. You do get that kind of sense of sometimes scientists saying, there's no point in me trying to communicate my stuff because it's not interesting. Nobody will be excited about it. There's this sort of sense of siloing off the fun science as being the science that can be communicated. And it's possibly absolutely not true because, I mean, I have had some stuff where I do a lot of science cafes, so I know that people are very capable of becoming involved in a discussion about risk or about priorities, given the opportunity. The difficulties, and I think this is my second hair, I'll come back to the first one. I think part of the problem around why we don't have necessarily this link between public engagement and public priorities, if you like, is because a lot of engagement has arisen from scientists or researchers being the ones who are expressing themselves as willing to go out and be engaging. And they, for whatever reason, might have this feeling that they don't want to talk about priorities, they don't want to talk about the rights and the political aspects of what they do. They almost want to keep that outside, and they want to talk about their work, and that's perfectly natural. But it does mean it kind of gets siloed off a bit.
So let me just give you an example here, right? Because that picture that you draw there is it's very appealing, isn't it? I mean, if you're a scientist, why would you want to go and have a political debate in public? I mean, nobody would want to do that. So I went to and did an observation at Café Scientifique in Dundee, which is held in Sensation Science Centre, which is one of the Millennium Project science centres in Scotland. So it's a kind of quirky building. It's big open spaces and it has an angled roof. So the roof above you is about like 70 feet high or something. And this guy was doing a talk on renewable energy, which is why I'd gone. It did a great talk. There was actually quite a lot of politics in it. He was talking about subsidy schemes and developers optimising subsidy schemes and about how that had changed, what kind of technology we had. All brilliant stuff. And he got to the end of his talk, which he struggled with because he didn't have any slides. And first hand up. How is it that you can be talking about renewable energy in the most energy inefficient building I have ever been in my life, and all the time that you've been talking, you've had 3 screens on that have not been showing anything at all because you haven't got any slides? I mean, if you do a search for scientific citizenship in America, it talks about scientists exercising their citizenly capabilities, and you see the story of Einstein not teaching to segregated kind of classrooms and that kind of thing, about standing up as an elite member of society, scientists standing up for something. And so you do wonder about somebody, I don't mean to pick on this poor chap that did his talk that he was obviously terrified for, but it's kind of, is that really a massive link to think, okay then, so I'm talking about renewable energy here, and this is what I do for a living, but I'm completely oblivious to kind of the whole kind of material environment that I'm working in and communicating in. But that's a little bit of materiality and politics that's not big politics, not big scary politics, is it?
No, I don't think so. I think there is absolutely nothing wrong. You know, as researchers, as scientists, we are necessarily embedded in our society, and it's really interesting that unwillingness to address questions, particular questions. You know, no, I don't want to talk about that. It's outside my capabilities. Is that sort of encouragement?
No, I think your hypothesis that there should be a link between engagement and the big theme from society strikes me as a little bit surprising, because I would not have thought that there is a link necessarily, because I think we have to recognize that most scientists are either too busy or not necessarily would not engage or do not know how to engage. Most scientists I know, researchers I know, are struggling to get their own stuff working, and the agenda of public engagement is something that's coming from the outside. It's coming from the Research Council. It's something that is imposed upon scientists as something that is seen as good for science, but it's certainly not necessarily good for scientists. It has become part of the RAE, and all the departments, science departments or computing technology, are struggling with that. They're trying to make sense of it. So that it's an agenda coming from the outside. And most engagement from the academic community is naturally around the science that happens in universities, which doesn't necessarily have to do with the big themes. Sometimes there's an overlap. So there isn't a central authority that organizes science around big themes. So there isn't any central authority that organizes public engagement around these big themes.
I'm going to ask you now, right? So if public engagement is good for science and it's not good for scientists, who's it supposed to be good for? Is it supposed to be good for publics? Is it supposed to be good for society? Who's it supposed to be good for?
And this brings us back to your accountability question. I mean, accountability is a very difficult issue. And it's kind of easy to frame it around this notion of public value, I think, as part of the responsibility is a strong word, being to demonstrate the public value. And I don't mean utility, and I don't mean usefulness, and I genuinely mean value.
No, I think it has very much to do, at least in the field where I come from, which is computing. It has very much to do with jobs, getting people connected to a supposed future growth area or an important area, and it has to do with fostering UK PLC, economic growth in this area, and having people moving into this field. So the whole public engagement area is connecting academic work with a supposed benefit to society in a very pragmatic way. It's not that people are really interested, care about the scientific arguments and results necessarily, and fostering scientific debate. Not necessarily. It's part of it, but it's only a tiny part of it. I think it's more, it has very much to do with economic arguments.
Yeah, I think that you're right, that careers and kind of securing a stream of kind of qualified and interested and motivated people into a field of research that's seen as important. I would still class that as kind of a social goal. I mean, that's a worth, as long as you've kind of chosen your ducks correctly, and the thing that you think is going to be the growth thing is going to be the growth thing, or we can make a UK can make a good contribution, then that is a really important social thing. Employment is really important, education is really important. So I don't think that's a different thing. And I think there's a really interesting role of business in there. I think to try and do that without business, which I know some people vehemently believe that we should, is a bit of a mistake. I think that you need companies in there to say, this is the kind of work that we can give you, this is what we do, this is it's all about making it real, isn't it? About not talking about things in the abstract, but saying, this is how it actually is. I think you wanted to say something?
Yeah,
Sorry, Kate.
Make a small comment. I've been observing that we've been using the word science
Okay.
in a rather ambiguous way in my mind, at least, mainly because of, I thought that you during your presentation at least, you were talking about science in the sense of technology, and at the same time, just recently we've been talking about science in the sense of research.
Okay.
So in my mind, and I don't think that in order to provide any answer to the questions we've been looking at, I think we shouldn't deal with these two meanings as being interchangeable.
How would you separate them?
I would say that maybe, I don't know. Initially, I thought during the presentation even that science, rather technology is the product of science, and I would say that this concept of citizenship, reason why even citizens are showing interest in science is because of the product of science, not necessarily science as an education process, for example. It's because maybe of the technology that it's being offered to the citizens, that how it affects their lives, that they are showing interest in science. It's because of the aftermath of science, the technology. So, for example, just to give you the question on whether citizens are allowed to have an opinion in what kind of scientists should do.
Yeah.
I feel sympathy for the persons who said we shouldn't allow the children to drive the bus, because I think I understand what he meant. I don't fully agree with that, of course, but these are my thoughts.
Rick?
Well, it's a really good set of issues you opened up. For me, it kind of comes back to the second question of Bev, which was the question about, how do you ensure that universities and communities, citizens, can ask the right questions to start with. And in a way, this whole kind of notion of kind of upstream public engagement kind of slightly connects with that. I mean, it's about, asking the right questions and then finding the solutions to those questions, so that you have some kind of shared responsibility around what the product sells. I mean, that's the kind of ideal, that's the kind of, and it connects into that kind of, for me, it connects into that kind of RE impact agenda around this notion of conceptualization of research. I mean, we spend a lot of activity now being put into how people actually conceptualize research projects. For me, the work starts before the proposal goes in. I mean, it's about actually so how do you frame the questions in the right way? What are the right questions to even ask in the first place? And part of that responsibility is down on research council, I think, before even any researchers get involved. So I went to a really good event in Bristol just before Christmas with a Canadian guy there. He's the head of the Canadian Social Science Research Council. Really, really interesting guy. And he kind of outlined how he changed the way that they conceive research proposals. So it's a much freer process. So you basically say, okay, as long as you are asking for roughly the right money, this is how much you can ask for, these are the kind of rules in terms of what you can claim. Above and beyond that, you work out what you want to look for, and you ask the people that you want to be involved in that research process what they would like. So the whole process was opened up. It was a much freer kind of set of processes than we have in the UK. You call people. And even the review process was opened up. So you said, right, rather than having peer review, I'm trying to remember what they called it now. I'm going to forget what they called it. But it was essentially, it was a more open process where you say, it's not just academics who are involved in this reviewing process, it's everybody who will be affected by that, by the outcomes of the research.
Which is, of course, the opposite of what has happened in the UK.
Yeah. So it was really, it's kind of, jaw-dropping in a way. It just changed the way you completely conceptualise everything, and it brings in your kind of question about culture and what actually matters. Do you know what I mean? What do people think matters? What do citizens think matters? It takes you to the kind of responsibility, ideas of responsibility. You say, okay, let's have that kind of extended peer review committee or extended review community and say, let's open the whole thing up.
Yeah, that's nice to stakeholders, all of them.
Yeah, and you say, okay, you're responsible, not just the conceptualisation process. come back again.
So you can see that as if you wanted to kind of go down that route of changing that process between research active people and all sorts of user communities, what would be the role of the science communication infrastructure in that? Do you think they have any special role? Because I asked this question when I went to this Open Places meeting. I said, why? Why do science centres need to get involved in improving people's lives? I mean, what is it that why are you getting this money from the EU? I always ask questions like that. Why are you getting this money from the EU to do this? What's your kind of bit of contribution? I hope I didn't quite phrase it in that way, but you never know. And they said, because we're trustworthy. People trust us. Because we communicate science, we are seen to have a value that's about kind of independence and trustworthiness and honesty, and actually that's what's being leveraged there, as well as kind of bits of, actually being able to physically get people together and be a convener. A lot of it is about brand science, saying, okay, let's get people to talk to each other. I'll just shut up.
I just wanted to give you a really specific example of something. So in this youth project to help with needs in Lincoln, we are starting with young people who are unemployed, and we're hoping to do user-centred design so they can design their own apps to help themselves get into work and training. So that's the kind of thing where you would, but somebody's obviously got them, and they can't just start designing their own apps. So that's where the science communication comes in there. So I think it's about capacity building and helping with capability, but only where the user group actually desires that capability.
Yeah. That's interesting, isn't it? Capacity building.
And that actually happens in a lot of development projects, like international development projects. Because, unless it's part of culture and art, science is like a need-to-know thing. If you're not a scientist, why would you?
Well, some people don't think that, do they? I mean, you clearly think that, right? But, like Michelle Calon doesn't think that.
I know. But
I don't think I think that. I think that science, and I'm quite where you are actually, I think that science and scientific knowledge has got so much power that it is, in terms of the distribution and allocation of resources, and in terms of the way that we come to make decisions and the way that you're expected to make a decision. I think that it's kind of in everybody's interest to kind of start to understand how some of that process works. I'm not completely on board with the whole
is it the process
thing.
or abstract science? That's where it's like, it's the process that we need to understand, not.
No, but I think a lot of these arts projects, like you said, is capacity building, like I said, but it's building trust, isn't it? Trying to counteract past failures that we've had with consumer skepticism, for example.
Gosh, that was I could just pick apart that whole sentence there. Can we write that down? Past failures with consumer perception and
Consumer skepticism.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Sticking science communication faster on a massive policy pole.
Yeah.
Because you said before about how do we do this? I mean, how do we involve people? But aren't we already doing that in the kind of futures type thinking? You're trying to get people together and trying to forecast the future and imagine what it might look like. And then once we've got a few case studies together, backcasting with regards to what might lead to that. And that's what they're doing at the moment with kind of risk type decision making in government.
It's not a participatory based technique though, is it? It's a, do you know what I mean? There might be some representative people in there, but it's not a wide scale kind of engagement exercise.
At the moment it's not, but I think that's only because the methodologies haven't been developed properly. But I think it should be.
Do you? You see kind of that kind of futures thinking opened up to on a kind of wide scale basis for large numbers of people to get involved in?
Yeah, I say that yes cautiously, but I don't know how that would be done, but yes. That's
Well, are you familiar with DEC's My 2020 project? Their kind of future energy calculator, and so you can say where you think energy should come from in 2020, and anybody can do that online. I did it. It's quite tough. I ended up filling Wales with wind farms, and I had something like 29 nuclear power stations. I thought I could do the whole of the country with 3, but apparently they're not as big as I thought they were. But it's when you actually come down to move the levers, it's more difficult than you think. So maybe digital means are a means by which kind of large people can be engaged in futures type work.
It's a really interesting idea, because you then say, okay, you can make, if you like, you can make that process transparent up
Yeah.
to a point.
Yeah.
And say, okay, these people contribute in these ways to these decisions as a way of kind of counting, okay, and these are the kind of inescapable moments of decision. We don't like the outcome, but blimey, at least you had a chance to have a say. You know what I mean? It changes the discourse. I mean, that was a lot of the kind of concern around GM Nation, wasn't it? Do you know what I mean? Okay, it's too late in the process, all the decisions are made. But, you know, there are other people who said, well, actually, if you look at the way that the decisions were being made, at least you could say there were opportunities. Do you know what I mean? You've got rights, responsibilities, you've got to have opportunities then as well. Do you know what I mean? Otherwise, you just get all the blame and no opportunity to actually.
But is there ever, sorry, is there ever just one decision though? I mean, we're talking about products coming through onto the market, and there isn't ever just one decision. It's like there might be, I mean, GM is particularly difficult because we have not an embargo, what's the word I'm looking for? Moratorium, thank you. A moratorium on it, and so there is a yes-no decision, but you know that won't be a yes-no. It'll be we can have a little trial here, we can do this, or we'll put it on Shetland, or whatever. It's never kind of the big. I'm not sure I completely buy into this. Oh, it's all too late, and it's an ongoing governance process, isn't it? Surely.
I mean, that's where the inescapable moment of decision doesn't really work, because it's actually moments continue.
Yeah, well, Move goes on to talk about how what we need is a proliferation of agonistic spaces. So she talks about how we need lots of different spaces. Do you like that? Can I have a round of applause for that? Where people can disagree. And so I'm thinking, actually maybe that's where the science infrastructure the science communication infrastructure comes in. I think we're out of time. Did you want to say something?
We've got like 30
just-
seconds if somebody's bursting.
I just
to say
agree.
something.
I just wanted to agree with what you said, but I don't think it is just one decision. But I think that's the importance of that kind of futures type decision, because what seems to be a bad decision today can lead to the ultimate decision in the future. Well, it's just.
Okay.
Good stuff.
Just wanted to ask you to first of all say thank you, Bev, for doing that, and just ask you to join me in saying thank you in the usual way to Bev for a fascinating